In 2012, the CDC estimated that at least 150,000 people worldwide died from the 2009 swine flu. On April 17, 2020, the 150,000 first person died of COVID-19, meaning this year's pandemic just passed the lower end of swine flu's range in roughly 1/3 the time. Let's see how COVID-19's fatality count compares with every other epidemic that's killed over 500 people in the 2000s. Hi everyone! So I want to switch the style of this video from the cinematic stuff you saw earlier to a more commentary style because there's more I want to talk about. So recently I've been toying around with this data from Worldometer and from the University of Washington's interactive map by Bo Zhao, and I'm trying to use this data to get a better picture of how the lockdowns of each country are actually affecting the spread of the virus. So with that being said, let's head to this Google spreadsheet I made to do a bunch of back-of-the-hand calculations. Now as a disclaimer, I'm not an epidemiologist, so a lot of the methods I'm using might be complete bogus, but I thought it's just a cool thought experiment, so I'm not going to be super rigorous with everything. Okay, so first off, this orange graph is pretty self-explanatory. It's the number of new reported cases of COVID-19 in the hardest hit province of Hubei, China. You can think of it as the derivative of this graph you see everywhere, which is the total number of reported cases of COVID-19 in Hubei, where the increase of each point in this graph reflects the actual height of this graph. And this little blip on the right corresponds to when China retroactively increased their estimates by about 50% 2 months after the fact. So I don't think this reflects any actual second outbreak in Hubei. Now I did apply a little bit of smoothing to this graph to get rid of weird time zone delays, but for the most part, this orange graph is as close to the news reports as you can get. So I haven't applied any weird tinkering to it yet. So I'm sure by now many of you viewers have already seen this Medium post by Thomas Pueyo, where he shows the reported cases of COVID-19 in Hubei in yellow, but then also shows the actual date that those cases first showed symptoms in blue or bluish gray. And the Chinese government was able to obtain this blue curve by asking patients when they first noticed symptoms in their own personal lives. Why is this important? Well, a lot of critics will point to China putting the province of Hubei into lockdown on January 23rd as too early of a measure when you consider that the total number of cases at the time in the whole country was less than 1,000, as you can see here. But because there is a delay between when citizens actually contract the virus and become contagious, and when the test results actually return positive, by January 23rd, there were actually quite a lot more people infected with the virus, these are all the blue graphs here, than China could actually report, which is the yellow ones here. When countries try to decide when to enter and exit lockdown, they need to have a good estimate for how big these blue bars are, not the yellow bars. Unfortunately, this two-sided data set isn't really available for most other countries. It seems like China's the only one who really has these two curves. So what I'm gonna try to do with this video is start with just the orange curve, which every country has, because every country has data of their reported cases of COVID-19. Take that data, modify it somehow, and arrive at an estimation of this blue curve, which is the actual number of cases of COVID-19. That way, we could get a good estimate of what Italy's blue curve looks like, or what the United States' blue curve looks like. Since we have no actual data, any reasonable estimate's probably better than nothing. So let's get started. If we head to the CDC's website, we can see that symptoms for COVID-19 typically appear after 2 to 14 days, which means our incubation period is 2 to 14 days. So on our spreadsheet, let's say contract virus on day 0. Now this is a super questionable assumption, but I'm going to say assume the 2 to 14 incubation day range is a normal distribution covering 2 standard deviations. And the reason I'm doing that is because 2 standard deviations will cover 95% of cases, which is a pretty good p-value or whatever that means. With this assumption, we can assume that the distribution of incubation periods would have a mean of 8 days, since that's the center, and a standard deviation of 3 days, since the range is 12 days and it needs to cover 2 standard deviations on either side. So, if you contract the virus on day 0, so the x-axis is days since contracting, then the highest concentration of people will start showing symptoms on day 8, right here. But there will be a spread, and the spread will look something like this, where 1 standard deviation gets us to 5, 1 standard deviation in the other direction gets us to 11. So this distribution looks like this. And like all normal distributions, we have 34% of the population residing here, 34% here, roughly 14, 14, and then 2, and 2. Now, is this accurate? Probably not. I've seen reports saying that the mean is actually at 5, which is way off of here, but other places report a week, so it's hard to say for sure, but let's use this as a starting point. Now, we're not done yet, because if you start showing symptoms according to this distribution, you still haven't tested positive for the virus. In fact, the next steps are for you to go to a testing station, get tested, and wait for results to come back. Now, the amount of time that this takes can vary from country to country, but I'm just going to say all of this takes 2 days. Now, you might be like, wow, that's way too fast. But considering that this estimation may have been too slow, if we add these two together, then maybe they'll cancel out. And overall, the total time distribution from contraction to testing positive equals n with a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. So perhaps a better way to interpret this all is that you start showing symptoms with a mean of 6 days, and then you get your test back in a mean of 4 days. That together adds up to this number right here. But either way, I'm just going to assume that our overall distribution of time is mean 10 days, standard deviation 3 days. So that looks like something like this, where the vast majority of people, 95%, go from contracting the virus to testing positive for the virus in 4 to 16 days. Okay, so we've been riding on a lot of assumptions so far, but let's get back to what the purpose of all of this is. We're trying to find a way to just look at the orange graph as input and estimate the blue graph as accurately as possible from it. As a reminder, almost all countries have access to this orange graph, which is the number of reported cases of COVID-19. It seems like Hubei, China is the only place that has access to this blue graph, which is the actual number of cases. But we'd like to derive the blue graph from the orange graph using some mathematical model so that we can get the blue graph from everywhere. So now that I've talked about this normal distribution, let's use it on the graph to see what happens. So first let's focus on one day. February 4th, which is this orange bar right here, seemed to have the most reports of coronavirus at around 3,700. But knowing the shape of this graph, we could say that of these 3,700 people who tested positive on February 4th, a good chunk of them actually got the virus 10 days earlier on January 25th. And that's actually, let's mark that as 10, the peak of the curve. But a lot of them also had a 9-day lag, or maybe they had an 11-day lag. And actually, what's going to happen with these 3,700 people is that they will spread out into a normal distribution where the mean is 10 and the standard deviation is 3. So we have the people of a 7-day lag, 4-day lag, and in the other direction, 13-day lag and 16-day lag. Again, with 95% of people falling between 4 and 16. So perhaps these people on the right who contracted the virus on January 31st and got tested really, really quickly, maybe they are in positions of power or just have better access to hospitals in general, or maybe they got sick really quickly. And then the people on the other end of the spectrum perhaps have worse access to hospitals, or maybe the virus lingers in their body for longer, so they didn't even know they had the virus for a couple weeks, which is why it took so much longer. But as a big picture, we generally see that a very spiky point turns into a very spread out lump of actual contraction dates. For February 5th, which had slightly fewer people, we produce yet another normal distribution curve that's slightly smaller and further to the right, and these people get spread out there. And what we're going to do is apply this bar to normal distribution curve operation for every single orange bar, and then we're not going to overlap them, we're going to stack them on top of each other to get total accumulative counts of how many people actually contracted the virus for each day. And the hope is that with just the orange curve, doing all of this crazy dividing, multiplying, and adding gives us a final sum that's very close to what you see in the data. So let's see how well it matches up. All of that work finally gives us an image of this. So the orange line, again, as I said before, closely reflects what the news reports. And the blue line, which is trying to estimate when people actually contracted the virus, precedes it by an average of 10 days. But due to the spreading of the normal curves, it is wider and not as tall. So this kind of feels like a shift and smear in a way. I think in his coronavirus video, Minute Physics also mentioned how the graph of the true infection rates would be a shift and a spread of the reported coronavirus cases, so I'm not the only one who had this idea. But look, the blue curve here is the estimate, and up here at 50% transparency, I have the true data from Thomas Pueyo's graph. And let's overlay the two and see how good it looks. It looks like that. Not a perfect match, of course, but no estimation ever is. I'm not sure why the orange line doesn't match up with the bars perfectly because it is the actual news, but whatever. The blue estimation line though, sometimes it seems like it jumps the gun and is a couple days ahead of the actual data, like it is in the lower part of this rise, and sometimes it seems like it's behind by a couple days in the later half of the rise, and then the descent looks pretty spot on. So I think this is as close as we're going to get. I did do a bit of tweaking, so having the mean be 11 days was an option, but it didn't match as closely with the data, so I changed it to 10. Long story short, using this super presumptive guess of how long delays take, it seems like we could get a pretty good picture of where the blue estimation line is, just given the orange news reported line. With China, that's not really necessary because we have the true blue line, but with cases like Italy where we don't have the data, this estimation is all we have to go off of. So this orange line is what you've seen in the news, and you may recall that Italy went on full lockdown on March 9th. And it does seem like, oh wow, the cases continue to rise for another week and a half. Like astronomically so. So did the lockdown really fail? Well, if you look at the blue line, which is the number of actual cases, March 9th sits about right there. And you can see that that's when the curve started to bend downward and go downward. Another thing to note is that because the blue curve lags the orange one by about 10 days, we have to stop the estimation about 10 days before the present. And I'm actually stopping at 16 days before the present. So the people who got infected on April 5th, the last stragglers of April 5th infecteders, are finally testing positive. I mean, the earliest ones were probably in like April 9th, 10th, and 11th, but the stragglers, we need to capture everyone, so the stragglers are finally jumping on board. I did the same for South Korea, who saw a huge spike in reported cases in late February, but then saw one of the fastest declines. And then I also did it for my home country of the United States, which has seen the largest number of cases, and the news is acting all doom and gloom about it. But you should notice that the exponential growth that we saw in March hasn't really happened in April. It's held about constant. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's more complicated. So to answer that, we'll have to talk about growth rates. Okay, back to Hubei, China. According to our blue estimation line, for the number of new infected people per day, on January 19th, an estimated 1,430 new people got infected. On January 20th, an estimated 1,650 people got infected, and so on and so on. So every day, more people are getting infected than the day before. So as a very rudimentary definition of growth rate, I'm just going to say it's the number of cases today divided by the number of cases yesterday. So what does this mean? Well, if we went from 1,400 on this day to 1,600 on the next day, and then almost 1,900 the next day, it seems like each new day we're adding about 1/7 of the pre-existing count onto itself. So the growth rate as I define it here is going to be about 1 plus 1/7, or about 1.14. Now, if you can hold exactly constant, as happens near the very top of the graph where the count is about 3,900 for 3 days in a row, then your growth rate is going to be exactly 1. And if you're on the descent, then your growth rate is going to be less than 1. It'll be 0.9 if you're losing 10% of your new case count every day. So doing this calculation is super easy, and it gives us this green graph. So this green graph is the growth rate. It's like a relative rate of change of the blue graph. So when I was talking about that rise from 1400 to 1600 to 1800 around January 20th earlier, that corresponds to right here where the graph says that on January 20th we were rising by about 15% each day, pretty close to the 1 plus 1/7 I was talking about earlier. Now the reason why growth rate is so important is because if it were to continue the same way, it can determine the difference between a pandemic spiraling out of control and fizzling out without a huge impact. So I'm sure you've heard this all many times, but exponential growth is really sensitive to the growth rate, and it can happen really fast. So of course we want to make this graph go down, and you might think, oh, look at this, we dropped from 1.45 down to 1.14. That drop is really good and we're on the right track. But are we? Because imagine if this green line, instead of descending below 1 as it does here, imagine if it were to stay constant at about 1.14 for the rest of eternity. That would mean after every day there are 14% more cases than the day before, and I'm sure you can already see where this is going. After a month we'll have 50 times more cases per day. After 2 months we'll have 2,000 times more cases per day. And after a year, I mean, it's just ridiculous, like trillions and trillions more cases per day. Of course, exponential growth does not continue forever, but the general idea here is that if we don't get this green line to go below 1, we're in a lot of trouble. Now, if the green line hits 1 and stays at 1, I mean, that's actually not great either, because all that means is that we have the same number of infected people every single day. So if at this exact point Hubei is reporting 3,000 new infected people per day, which I think it was at its peak, then descending to 1 and holding it there will mean that 3,000 new people will be infected every day for the rest of eternity. And that corresponds to over 1 million people in a year, and so on, which is not great. So with that being said, it's pretty clear that the goal is to get this green line to go below 1 and stay below 1. If you can get to this point here where it's at 0.7 consistently for many days in a row, then the disease will have every 2 days, and that's extremely powerful. If you have every 2 days, then after a month, you only have 1/50,000th the number of new infections per day as you used to. So then the disease will be eradicated in a matter of weeks. Of course, there's nothing magic about 0.7. If you're at 0.9, it'll just take a little longer to eradicate the disease, but you'll get there eventually. So all of this talk is essentially to say 1.0 is the most important threshold of this image. If you're above it, your pandemic will spiral out of control. If you're below it, it'll stay contained at a finite maximum value. So with these lockdowns, the real push is to get this green line to just go like that. And as soon as you cross that 1.0 line, you're not in the clear, but you're on the right track. Okay, so that's a lot of talk. Let's look at the actual dates that countries went on lockdown and see what effect that had on the green line. Of course, correlation does not imply causation, so I'm not going to make any claims about that here. This is just a dumping ground for me to toy around with the data and see what I get. So, China went on lockdown on January 23rd, which is right here. So let's put that line right on January 23rd, like so. So everything to the left of this line is pre-lockdown, and everything to the right of the line is post-lockdown. If we look at the growth rate, I mean, we can't say anything for certain, and perhaps these waves up and down would have continued for a long time, and who knows what causes these waves here. But it does kind of seem like Hubei was descending very slowly at 1.14 in mid-January, and then at some point it descended a lot faster, crossed over 1 at around January 30th, which is where the peak of infections would occur. And then as soon as the growth rate went below 1, then the number of new cases each day could actually start descending. Just take note of this graph. This is the same thing, but with growth rate. It looks like it worked well for China, and eventually we had extremely low growth rate. Okay, let's do the same thing with Italy. Italy went on lockdown on March 9th, which is right here. Again, pre-lockdown, post-lockdown. Here's the growth rate in Italy. It doesn't have as much waviness to it, but it looks like it was holding at about 1.10 and then dropped to below 1 right here, about a week after lockdown. That's when the peak of infections also seemed to happen based on the estimation. So take that with a grain of salt. Again, correlation does not imply causation, but it does seem like there is a steeper descent of growth rate during lockdown than before lockdown. So that's Italy. South Korea is harder to say because they never went on full lockdown, and part of the reason their case count went up so quickly at the end of February was just because they were testing so much. So it's really hard to say whether this huge lump in mid-February actually means anything. But the growth rate was already falling below 1 in late February, which was way ahead of any other non-China country. Korea executing their plan for rapid testing seemed to work really well for them. And then the United States is the hardest one to really say because every state went on lockdown at a different time, and there was also different severities of lockdown. And where I'm living right now, no one's really enforcing people stay inside. So you can still wander about and intermingle with other people if you wanted to, it's just not advised. With that being said, I did mention that through the month of April, the number of new cases in the United States per day does seem to be holding constant instead of rising exponentially. And what that means is the growth rate has actually hit 1, but has ever so slightly fallen below it. And many governors in the United States want to lift these lockdown restrictions, and that would inevitably make the growth rate go up a little bit. So can we do that? I mean, our growth rate is already below 1, which is a good sign. However, one thing you should keep in mind is that if every day a stat is decreasing by a factor of 1 over n, then the final sum of that sequence will be n times the original. This is just a general rule of thumb. So as an example, let's say a viral video gets 1 million views on day 1, and then maybe each viewer only manages to get 0.8 of their friends to watch it the next day on average. So it only gets 800,000 views the next day. If we just repeat that forever, and then if you just sum that all up, well, we dropped by 1/5 every day, right? We went from 1 million to 800,000. So 1/5, the sum of all that will be about 5 times the original. So 5 times 1 million gives us about 5 million views on the viral video. So why is that relevant? Well, you may be cheering on United States' ability to get their growth rate to 0.9857. That's the lowest it got on April 1st. But that means every new day, we're dropping about 1/60th new cases. So in this case, n equals 60. That's because 59 over 60 is about 0.985, roughly. This is a ballpark estimate. So what that means is we have 30,000 cases per day right now. If we can hold the growth rate at 59/60ths forever, we will end up with 60 times as many cases as that total, which is a lot. I think it's 1.8 million, and we don't want millions of people getting infected. So all of this is really to say that realistically, we want this growth rate to go well below 1. If we're below 0.9, then we'll only have less than 10 times the current daily count of new cases in the future. And if we can get down to 0.7 like China did, it'll only be 3 times the daily count. So should we lift these quarantine restrictions? I don't personally think so. Just looking at this data and seeing how pitifully below 1 we really are, like this isn't good progress. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. Just that I was kind of surprised by graphs like this where it seemed like the lockdowns really did have an effect on the growth rate of the virus. Yeah, so everyone stay home so we can bring the growth rate down even faster. Wear masks if you're outside so that the virus particles can't go from one person's mouth to another's. You've heard it all a million times, so I won't say it again. But I think this is just a good way of giving hope to people that lockdowns are helping, and it's not just an endless, draconian violation of human rights. It has a tangible effect, as you can see here. And the goal is, like, we want to give people as many rights as possible as soon as possible. But that only happens when the growth rate goes down to here, and then things can be lifted once the orange line essentially flatlines at 0. If there are 0 new infections a day, then even if the growth rate is 1 trillion, 0 times 1 trillion is 0. I know that's questionable math. It's like asking what is 0 divided by 0. So I don't want to get into that discussion right now, but basically keep your hopes up and things will hopefully get better in the near future. Okay, this was Carrie rambling about weird math stuff. Thanks for watching these Abacaba videos, and goodbye!